This is Terrence Andre Banks with Information Age Financial Solutions, coming to you with another video in regards to the government shutdown, a potential government shutdown. And this one comes from an article I read from nestman.com. Again, some of these websites I'm pulling up, they may not be familiar with them, but they always looking for good information, especially out there. And this article struck out to me, of course, because of the title itself, Your Government Shutdown Survival Guide. And this is by Mark Netzman, August 29, 2017. And I'm going to read a little bit about the article because it's just chock full of different nuggets and definitely explains the time that we're facing. I had done a couple other videos in the past about the government shutdown, and it doesn't happen. They seem to keep averting it. But this is one that provides a little bit a different perspective, kind of pulls a little information from before. But I just want to give you some excerpts and definitely encourage you to take a look at it. So let me go down and kind of scroll down and read down a little bit of the article itself. On or around October 2nd, the U.S. federal government was shut down again. The actual date could be a bit earlier or later, depending on how the government cash flows. Technically, the government should have shut down on March 15, 2017. And I read an article about that, of a potential government shutdown back then too. That was the date that a congressionally approved temporary extension of the debt ceiling expired. So on that date, the amount of debt on the books was $19,808 billion. Became the new debt ceiling. Since then, the Treasury hasn't been able to issue any more federal debt. Instead of shutting down the government, the Treasury has been cooking the books to pay the bills. Payments to the federal workers' retirement and disability funds have ended. And this is important to point out because I don't think anybody really talked about that before, especially in the other videos I've done regarding the government shutdown. I didn't know that was being the case. And again, this is something to be explored, but definitely something I'm going to read again. Payment to the federal workers' retirement and disability funds have ended. And what I mean by being explored is saying that you have to verify that, but that's an interesting update. The Treasury also is barred against federal pension, Social Security, and Medicare trust funds. Again, all of these different institutions that we've been under the illusion to believe that they're fully funded, they're not. It's based on the good and credit of the federal government, the United States, and its ability to tax its citizens or print the money. But again, it's worth repeating again. The Treasury is also barred against federal pension, Social Security, Medicare trust funds. But that can only go on so long. Without congressional authorization to raise the debt ceiling, some government service will have to end in about a month. President Trump and congressional leaders want to raise the debt ceiling without any more restrictions. It's easy to see why. Politicians get reelected when they spend money on things that benefit voters, and just as importantly, when they spend on things that benefit the people and corporations that finance their campaigns. Two go hand in hand. If you're putting me in office and you're funding me, you're going to find a way to definitely finance with the things that I want to get done. And that's just logical, especially if I'm providing you the capital for you to get in office. But the influential Freedom Caucus in the House of Representatives opposes an unlimited increase in the debt ceiling. It favors raising the debt ceiling only an additional $1.5 trillion. Only $1.5 trillion. Just enough to keep the government afloat until after the midterm elections in November 2018. The Freedom Caucus also wants to cut federal spending. Trump and congressional leaders have to take the Freedom Caucus seriously because the Freedom Caucus opposition to the partial repeal of Obamacare doomed that initiative early this year. Something interesting to point out. While the U.S. daily setting has been in existence since 1917, and it gives a little bit of history about the debt ceiling itself. The points to remember here is one thing that I like to just read out. Public opinion largely blamed the Republicans for the shutdown in 1920, but in 1997, a bipartisan consensus emerged in Congress to cut government spending. The result was 4 balanced budgets in a row for the first time since the 1920s. So this has been going on for a period of time, decades, as you can see. How the next government shutdown will unfold. Now, this is a good excerpt to read from here. The best case scenario for the looming shutdown will be a bipartisan deal along the same lines. In exchange for sharp cuts to entitlement spending, which Democrats want to avoid, Republicans would approve a higher debt ceiling. The outcome is very unlikely. Congress is far more polarized than it was 20 years ago. Even though it's been polarized, I don't believe personally that both sides don't want to see a government shutdown. But this has been some interesting times, to say the least. So in a recent poll, 57% of Americans oppose to raising the debt ceiling versus 20% who favor doing so. I don't know where they get the polls from, but apparently that's been the case. I don't think they really understood what the magnitude if they're not going to raise the debt ceiling. But a partial shutdown seems inevitable. Now, they've been talking about this, and I've done a couple of videos before that, the shutdown is probably imminent. To prepare for it, it's important to understand what parts of the government will be affected. There are two major sources of government spending, discretionary and non-discretionary. Discretionary spending represents expenditures that are authorized in annual congressional budgets. The Treasury will cut that spending first. That means hundreds of thousands of federal employees will be placed on furlough. Many government agencies will suspend operations. National parks will close. The FDA won't process applications for new drug therapies, and the IRS won't answer the phones. Although I like this little point he puts out. Although even now it's hit or miss getting through to a live person. That is definitely true if you haven't tried to call the IRS for any kind of questions. Some discretionary funding, national defense, border security, etc. will continue, although perhaps at a reduced capacity. Non-discretionary spending represent mandatory expenditures that have been permanently authorized by Congress. These include interest payments on federal debt, Social Security, Medicare, etc. So Social Security payments will be paid, federal debt will be paid, and the Medicare. So if you're anyone receiving those kind of services, and you don't have to worry, again, take that as a grain of salt, because it's been amazing with all the political and turmoil that we've been having, both in the States and across the world globally, that it's been going on this long. I didn't even think that trillions of dollars can be in. The United States was known as before as the largest creditor nation. Now it's the largest debtor nation in history. So, and this cannot, essentially, this can go on as long as the rest of the world continues to take the United States dollar. We can keep forcing it by military action. Either way, nothing is forever. But let me continue on with the article, because I kind of digressed there, but just pointing those other things out. So if the shutdown continues indefinitely, mandatory expenditures will be affected. For instance, in the 1995-1996 shutdown, the Treasury announced it wouldn't be able to make Social Security payments if the spending freeze continued. That's an interesting point. That won't happen this time. After a few weeks, Congress will cobble together a deal, and another political crisis will end, at least temporarily. A shutdown doesn't change the fact that the U.S. is broke. Good point. Longer term, the situation is much more serious. If Uncle Sam were a corporation, it would have been declared insolvent decades ago. Well, we all know that. But the United States has the ability to continue printing because, technically speaking, with the largest military in the world and the agreement with OPEC for all oil and energy to be paid in United States in U.S. dollars, it's kind of keeping it afloat, and that was agreed upon by most nations. But that's changing, especially with the different things going on in China and Russia, and they're coming to agreements and utilizing themselves and trying to bypass the dollar. But then, again, I digress. The bad news is that this fiscal gap, the deficiency in financing on unfolding mandates like Social Security, Medicaid, and military and federal pensions now exceeds $200 trillion. Okay, let's go back again. The bad news is that the fiscal gap, the deficiency in financing for unfunded mandates like Social Security, Medicare, and military and federal pensions now exceeds $200 trillion. And that doesn't even factor in the cost of future wars with North Korea, which seems to be inevitable, or any other nation or group Donald Trump or a future president decides to fight. Now, without a debt ceiling, the Treasury cannot continue to issue debt, buy notes, bills, and bonds of various maturities. And if you can't find anyone to buy them, the Federal Reserve can step in. That was a big part of the Fed's quantitative easing initiative to spur the economy out of the last recession. Indeed, nearly half of the Fed's balance sheet consists of federal debt. Can that go on forever? That's the question. Some economists predict that the QE will eventually lead to hyperinflation. If they're right, your Social Security check will cover only a week's worth of groceries, not an entire month's of expenses. Inflation is good for the government in the short term because it can repay its obligations in dollars that are less valuable than dollars that the ones it borrowed. But over the long term, inflation will lead to higher interest rates. Business will likely have to pay more to borrow money. Consumers will have to pay more to buy a home. Economic growth will slow. If the process continues indefinitely, the U.S. will eventually start to look a lot like Venezuela does now. If you haven't taken excerpts looking at Venezuela and reading some excerpts, you will see how bad the country is. But I'm not sure that inflation is an inevitable outcome of unlimited QE. For QE to spur economic growth, consumers and businesses must be willing to borrow, and banks must be willing to lend. It doesn't seem to be the case in the United States because everybody believes that it's going to continue going on, which explains why the numbers for personal debt in the United States actually are the same levels that they were before the crash of 2008. The Bank of Japan accelerated QE in 2013, announcing its commitment to purchase 80,733 billion of bonds annually. Japan is an example of QE on steroids, but inflation is running at only 0.5% annually. Because of Japanese experience, I think a more likely outcome than inflation is more economic stagnation. No matter how much QE the Fed engages in, and keep in mind that while QE doesn't stimulate the overall economy, it's very effective at producing bubbles in the price of stocks and other assets. When the bubble bursts, we'll experience a repeat of the global financial crisis of 2007-2008, except it will be worse this time. So he recommends cash in banks with rock solid balances and gold and other real assets as inflation hedges. I've read through most of the article itself. It's worth a look at, a full reading. Your Government Shutdown Survival Guide, and he points out a lot of good points to be concerned about, and look for that time frame around October 2nd or before. Until my next video, I'm out.